Oh, it's a mixture. I think it's certainly by design, because it's really the only way to organise your life.
So COVID must have been a terrible block for that kind of work.
A block, certainly from everybody's perspective. But it was intriguing to note how people, there was the word they kept using here, pivoted. So they pivoted using either the strengths of what they did before to deliver it slightly differently.
The royal family is destroyed. Princess Anne just exposed the one secret they swore would never see daylight. She revealed Prince Harry's real father on camera, and it's not who you think. The DNA proof Diana desperately hid, the test results the Queen banned from ever being seen, it's all been unleashed. King Charles is in absolute meltdown.
There's only so much that I can say because of the redaction process and the national security matters at hand, but everything. Because in beginning of 2020, I was scored the highest as far as risk was concerned. And then overnight, I was reduced to the lowest without actually going through the risk management board.
Meghan knew, Harry suspected, but now the truth is out and the monarchy is collapsing in real time. What Anne said next will leave you speechless. You need to hear this now before it gets taken down. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. What had begun as a controlled, almost ceremonial gathering transformed into something far more significant. Those present, including palace staff and members of the press, quickly realized they were witnessing not just another royal announcement, but something that would fundamentally alter the narrative surrounding one of the world's most famous families. Anne's words were measured and deliberate, each sentence carrying the weight of years of carefully guarded knowledge. The letter she read from was written in her own hand, prepared with the kind of precision that reflects both her military background and her lifelong commitment to duty. There was no emotional preamble, no attempt to soften what was about to be said. Instead, Anne dove directly into the matter at hand, outlining details that she claimed had been hidden for far too long. The content of her statement centered around Princess Diana and a secret that Diana herself had desperately wanted to protect, but only until the right moment arrived. According to Anne, Diana had been explicit in her wishes. She wanted the truth to remain buried while it served to protect her children, particularly Prince Harry. But Diana also recognized that there might come a time when continued silence would cause more harm than revelation. That time, Anne suggested, had now arrived. The letter referenced conversations between the two women, moments of vulnerability when Diana shared fears that extended far beyond the usual pressures of royal life. The crowd outside the palace gates began to swell as word spread through London. People stopped mid-stride, checking their phones as notifications flooded in. News channels interrupted regular programming. Social media platforms erupted with fragments of Anne's statement, often taken out of context, but powerful nonetheless. The phrases that escaped into the public sphere were enough to trigger intense speculation. Within minutes, the story had circled the globe, reaching audiences who might not typically follow royal news, but who understood instinctively that something monumental had occurred. Inside the room where Anne delivered her statement, the tension was palpable. Palace aides exchanged worried glances, their usual composure cracking under the pressure of the moment. Reporters, trained to maintain professional distance, found themselves struggling to process what they were hearing. Some reached for their phones, desperate to file breaking news alerts. Others simply sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the implications of what was unfolding before them. Anne spoke of Diana with evident respect, describing her as a young mother who found herself trapped between the demands of royal duty and the need to speak her truth. She painted a picture of isolation, of a woman who understood the power of the institution she had married into and who feared the consequences of challenging it directly. The secret Diana carried, Anne explained, was never meant to bring shame upon anyone, least of all her children. Instead, it was intended to expose a system that prioritized appearances and stability over honesty and human dignity. The most striking moment came when Anne addressed the late Queen Elizabeth directly. Without hesitation, she stated that the Queen had known about this matter. Not suspected, not been informed indirectly through palace gossip, but actually known. And according to Anne, the Queen had made a conscious decision to maintain silence, choosing institutional stability over personal truth. Anne's delivery of this information was notably neutral. She did not condemn her mother, nor did she offer justification for the decision. She simply presented it as fact, allowing those listening to draw their own conclusions about what such knowledge and subsequent silence might mean. The revelation carries particular poignancy given Prince Harry's current circumstances. At the very moment Anne was delivering her statement, Harry was thousands of miles away, traveling and completely unaware that his life story was being rewritten in real time. The contrast is almost cruel in its timing. While his name dominated every headline and his identity became the subject of global debate, he was moving through what he believed was an ordinary day. The disconnect between his experience and the reality unfolding back in Britain adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As Anne's words spread across the nation, reactions split immediately along various lines. Some people expressed feelings of betrayal, believing that the monarchy had deliberately misled the public for decades. Others felt vindicated, as if long-held suspicions had finally been confirmed. Many simply felt a profound sense of sadness for all involved, particularly for Harry himself. Here was a man who had already spent years grappling with questions about his place within the royal family, who had publicly discussed his struggles with identity and belonging, and who now faced the possibility that those struggles had roots deeper than anyone had fully acknowledged. The monarchy, an institution built on the bedrock principles of lineage and hereditary right, suddenly appeared vulnerable in ways it had not been in generations. The carefully maintained image of certainty that surrounds the royal family had been punctured. What remained was something altogether more human, more flawed, and perhaps more relatable, but also more fragile. For an institution that derives much of its authority from tradition and the unbroken chain of succession, questions about paternity strike at the very heart of its legitimacy. Anne concluded her statement without fanfare. She folded the letter, looked up at the assembled group, and offered no further comment. No questions were taken. No clarifications provided. She had said what she came to say, and that was the end of it. But of course, it was only the beginning. Because once words like these are spoken, they cannot be taken back. They exist now in the historical record, impossible to ignore or fully suppress, regardless of how the palace might wish to respond. The immediate aftermath saw a flurry of activity. Palace communications staff scrambled to formulate some kind of official response. Legal teams were reportedly consulted about potential ramifications. Family members were contacted, though many were apparently caught as off guard as the general public. The machinery of royal public relations, usually so smooth and effective, seemed to stall in the face of a revelation this significant coming from within the family itself. What makes Anne's decision particularly striking is her reputation. She has never been one to court publicity or drama. Throughout her life, she has been known for her work ethic, her dedication to her royal duties, and her preference for staying out of the spotlight. For her to take such a dramatic step suggests a level of conviction that cannot be easily dismissed. This was not an impulsive act or an attempt to settle personal scores. This was, by all appearances, a carefully considered decision to bring something into the light that she believed could no longer remain hidden. The questions now are numerous and profound. What exactly does Anne know, and how did she come to know it? What evidence exists to support her claims? How will the royal family respond officially? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for Prince Harry, a man who has already endured more public scrutiny than most people experience in a lifetime? As the world waits for answers, one thing has become abundantly clear. The story of the British royal family has just entered a new and unpredictable chapter, one that promises to challenge long-held assumptions and force difficult conversations about truth, loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets. To understand why Princess Anne chose this particular moment to break decades of silence, we need to look back at the woman herself and the careful observer she has always been. Throughout her life, Anne has occupied a unique position within the royal family. She was never destined for the throne, never the focus of intense succession planning, and perhaps because of that freedom from the heaviest burdens of monarchy, she developed a perspective that others in her position might not have gained. She watched, she listened, and most importantly, she remembered. Anne has always been characterized by loyalty and discipline. These are not just superficial traits, but core elements of her identity, shaped by her upbringing and reinforced through decades of royal service. While other members of the family maneuvered for position or public favor, Anne kept her head down and did her work. She attended engagements, supported charities, and maintained a steady presence that became so reliable it was almost invisible. But that invisibility was deceptive. Behind the facade of the dutiful princess was someone who understood far more than she let on. Those who worked closely with Anne over the years occasionally noticed moments that hinted at deeper currents beneath her composed surface. There were instances during family gatherings when she would fall silent at particular topics, her expression unreadable but somehow charged with meaning. Conversations in palace corridors sometimes ended abruptly when certain subjects arose, and there were looks exchanged with Diana, brief but significant, that suggested a shared understanding of things left unspoken. The relationship between Anne and her brother Charles had always been complex. They were siblings, yes, but also products of a system that often prioritized duty over emotional connection. Over the years, palace insiders noticed a certain tension between them, nothing overtly dramatic but present nonetheless. Conversations that seemed to circle around something neither was willing to name directly. Disagreements that appeared to be about one thing but carried the weight of something else entirely. Some of these moments of friction seemed to connect back to Diana in ways that were never fully explained at the time. Everything changed after a private meeting between Anne and the Queen. The exact details of that conversation have never been made public, and likely never will be. What is known is that Anne entered that meeting as one person and left as another. Those close to her marked a shift in her demeanour afterward. The trust she had always placed in the institution, in the family system itself, appeared to have been shaken. It was as if she had come face to face with a truth she had suspected but hoped was not real, and the confirmation had altered something fundamental in how she viewed her role. From that point forward, Anne began to operate differently. Not obviously, not in ways that would draw attention, but in subtle shifts that mattered. She started asking different questions, showing interest in documents and records that might not typically concern her. She became more selective about what information she shared and with whom. It was the behavior of someone who had realized that the official version of events was not always the complete version, and who had decided that perhaps certain truths deserved to be preserved rather than buried. Anne's collection of information was methodical. She did not rush, she did not make accusations. She simply gathered what was there to be found, piece by piece, document by document. She learned which archives contained sensitive materials and which records had been carefully relocated over the years. She discovered that the palace, for all its careful record-keeping, also had a talent for making certain things difficult to find. Files that should have been in one place turned up in another. Documents that should have existed seemed to have vanished entirely. These absences told their own story. Throughout this process, Anne confided in very few people. The circle of trust was extraordinarily small, limited to individuals whose discretion was beyond question and whose conscience aligned with hers. Among them was a royal physician whose professional ethics had been tested by the very situation Anne was investigating. Together, this small group operated in the shadows, bound together by shared knowledge and shared risk. They understood that what they were doing could have consequences, not just for them personally, but for the institution they had all served faithfully. Anne never acted impulsively during this period. She waited, watching for the moment when speaking would matter more than remaining silent. She understood timing in a way that reflected both her patience and her strategic thinking. Rushing forward with incomplete information or at the wrong moment would accomplish nothing except to create chaos without resolution. So she held back, even as the knowledge weighed on her, even as she watched situations unfold that she knew were built on foundations of deception. The death of Queen Elizabeth marked a turning point. For Anne, the passing of her mother represented more than personal loss. It represented the end of an era and the lifting of certain obligations that had bound her to silence. The promise she had made, whether explicit or implicit, had been to a woman who was both mother and monarch. With that woman gone, Anne found herself reconsidering the nature of loyalty itself. Was loyalty best expressed through continued silence, or had silence itself become a form of complicity in something she could no longer support? In the period following the Queen's death, those around Anne noticed changes. Her posture seemed different, as if a burden was settling more heavily on her shoulders. Her gaze became more direct, more searching. The careful restraint that had always characterized her remained, but the hesitation that sometimes accompanied it disappeared. She began revisiting old conversations in her mind, replaying moments from years past with new understanding. Words that Diana had spoken, warnings that had seemed emotionally driven at the time, now revealed themselves as carefully chosen attempts to communicate something vital. Anne started to see patterns she had missed before. The way certain topics had always been deflected, the speed with which particular stories had been shut down before they could gain traction, the subtle ways in which Harry had been treated differently, never overtly but consistently, as if he occupied a category slightly apart from the rest. These realizations built on each other, creating a picture that became impossible to ignore. The decision to come forward was not made lightly. Anne is not a woman given to dramatic gestures or emotional displays. For her to take such a significant step required a level of conviction that went beyond personal feelings. She spent sleepless nights weighing the consequences, understanding better than most what her revelation would unleash. She knew it would hurt people she cared about. She knew it would damage the institution she had served her entire life. But she had reached a conclusion that she could no longer avoid. Some secrets, Anne had come to believe, cause more damage when kept than when revealed. Some truths demand acknowledgement, not for the sake of scandal or revenge, but because their continued concealment corrupts everything built upon them. The longer a fundamental lie persists, the more it distorts reality around it, forcing everyone to participate in a deception that ultimately serves no one. Anne had watched this process unfold over decades, and she had determined that her continued participation in it would be a betrayal of everything she actually valued. The final piece that cemented her decision came in the form of a sealed envelope, something she had kept hidden for years in accordance with Diana's wishes. It was a tangible connection to a woman who had died far too young, who had carried burdens she should never have had to bear alone, and who had tried desperately to protect her children while also ensuring that certain truths would not be lost forever. Diana had entrusted Anne with this information for a reason, had chosen her specifically because she believed Anne would know when the time was right to act on it. That envelope had been given to Anne during a moment that few people witnessed. It was at a royal reception amid the glitter and pageantry that so often defined public royal life. But away from the cameras, in a quiet moment carefully orchestrated for privacy, Diana had pressed it into Anne's hands. The look that passed between them carried the weight of everything Diana could not say aloud. There were no witnesses to record what happened, no words exchanged that could be traced back later. Just a simple transfer of paper and ink, and with it, a responsibility that Anne accepted without fully understanding what it would eventually demand of her. Diana had been explicit about when the envelope should be opened, either when Harry reached the age of 35 or when the Queen passed away, whichever came first. These conditions were not arbitrary. They reflected Diana's calculation about when her son would be mature enough to handle difficult truths and when the institutional pressure to maintain silence might finally ease. Diana understood the system she was trapped within, understood its rhythms and its pressure points, and she had planned accordingly. Anne honoured that request with the same dedication she brought to all her duties. The envelope remained sealed, tucked away in a place where only she could access it, far from the prying eyes of palace staff or family members who might have questions. As the years passed and Harry grew into adulthood, as scandals came and went, as the family weathered various storms, Anne kept her promise. But the weight of that sealed envelope grew heavier with time, especially as she watched Harry struggle publicly with questions of identity and belonging that she knew had deeper roots than he realised. When Anne finally opened the envelope after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, the weight of what Diana had entrusted to her became immediately clear. The handwriting alone brought back memories of that reception years earlier, of Diana's expression and the quiet desperation in her eyes. But it was the contents of the letter that transformed speculation into something far more concrete. Diana had not written in riddles or vague suggestions. She had been direct, naming a man who had long existed at the margins of royal scandal, but never with this level of explicit confirmation: Major James Hewitt. The letter was brief, as Diana's most important communications often were. She understood that lengthy explanations could be discovered, intercepted, or misinterpreted. Instead, she focused on essential facts. She wrote about her suspicions regarding her medical records, claiming that they had been altered or manipulated to obscure certain truths. According to Diana, palace physicians had been given instructions that prioritized discretion over accuracy, a directive that came from the highest levels of palace administration. When she had pushed for independent medical testing, for verification that existed outside the palace's sphere of influence, she encountered resistance that went beyond mere bureaucratic obstacles. Diana described being warned in terms that left little room for misunderstanding. If she pursued independent confirmation of what she suspected, there would be consequences. Not just for her, which she might have been willing to accept, but for her sons. The threat was never explicitly detailed in the letter, but the implication was clear enough. The institution would protect itself, and those who threatened its stability would find themselves isolated, discredited, or worse. For a mother already struggling with the pressures of public life and a failing marriage, these warnings carried enormous weight. Anne later acknowledged that this was not the first time she had heard whispers about such threats. Palace life is full of rumours and speculation, and over the years she had caught fragments of conversations that hinted at uncomfortable truths. But there is a significant difference between second-hand gossip and reading, the direct testimony of someone who experienced these pressures firsthand. Diana's letter transformed abstract concerns into concrete reality. This was not tabloid fiction or the invention of conspiracy theorists. This was a mother's documentation of her own experience, written in her own hand, for the explicit purpose of ensuring that the truth would survive, even if she did not. But Diana's letter was only part of the evidence Anne had accumulated. Hidden among palace records, discovered during what was officially described as a routine estate audit, Anne found something even more damning. It was a document that should not have existed, or rather, should not have been allowed to continue existing. A DNA test report conducted in absolute secrecy with results that were scientifically unambiguous. The test had been performed in the early 1990s during the period when Diana's marriage to Charles was disintegrating, and rumours about her personal life had reached a fever pitch. The origins of this test revealed just how desperate Diana had become for certainty. Living under constant scrutiny, hounded by press speculation, and trapped in a marriage that had long since ceased to function, she needed to know the truth about her own life. She confided in a royal physician who had earned her trust through years of discreet service. This was a man who understood that his loyalty to his patient had to supersede his loyalty to the institution, at least in this particular instance. Together, they arranged for samples to be collected and tested in a manner that would leave no official trail. The methodology was carefully designed to avoid detection. Samples were obtained from Harry, from Prince Charles, and from the man Diana suspected but had never publicly named. The laboratory used for the analysis was private, with no connections to the palace or government institutions that might report back to interested parties. The results, when they arrived, were both definitive and devastating. The comparison between Harry and Charles showed zero probability of paternal relationship. The comparison between Harry and James Hewitt showed a probability exceeding 99.7%. In scientific terms, this was as close to certainty as such testing could provide. For Diana, these results must have confirmed what she had long suspected, but perhaps hoped was not true. The implications were staggering, not just for her personally, but for her children and for the institution she had married into. But what happened next demonstrated just how powerful the forces of institutional preservation could be. Within weeks of the test being conducted, the physician who had facilitated it was removed from his position. The official explanations cited retirement, a convenient story for a man who was not yet of retirement age and who had shown no previous inclination to step away from his work. Files related to the test began to disappear from hospital. Archives, records that should have been maintained as part of standard medical documentation, simply vanished. Diana, warned through informal channels that her actions had been discovered, realized that she had crossed a line the palace would not tolerate. The test results themselves were supposed to have been destroyed, eliminated from existence, as if they had never been created. But somehow, a copy survived. Whether through accident or deliberate preservation by someone with a conscience, the document found its way into palace records where it remained, misfiled and forgotten, until Anne's careful searching uncovered it years later. The report Anne discovered was thin, just a few pages, but stamped across the top in red ink was a directive that spoke volumes about how seriously the palace took this information. The words "forbidden to disclose" appeared alongside an abbreviation indicating that the order came directly from Her Majesty. This was not a suggestion or a guideline. This was a command from the monarch herself, instructing that the contents of this file were never to be shared, discussed, or acknowledged. For Anne, seeing this directive in the Queen's authority was a moment of profound realization. Her mother had not merely suspected or heard rumors, she had seen the evidence and made a conscious decision to bury it. Anne took the file and secured it in a location known only to her. She understood its value not as a weapon, but as insurance, as proof that would be needed when the time came to speak publicly. The document represented something the palace could not dismiss as speculation or tabloid invention. It was scientific evidence, properly conducted and documented, that contradicted the official narrative the royal family had maintained for decades. And now it was in Anne's possession, waiting for the moment when its revelation would serve a purpose beyond mere scandal. But if the evidence was so clear and the truth so accessible, at least to those with the right access and determination, why had Diana herself never come forward with it? This question haunted Anne as she contemplated her own decision to speak. The answer lay in Diana's fundamental concern for her children, particularly for Harry. Diana understood that exposing this truth would do more than embarrass the royal family or create a media sensation. It would fundamentally alter her son's understanding of who he was, where he came from, and what his place in the world might be. Harry had already grown up in an environment of intense scrutiny. From his earliest years, he had been the subject of commentary, comparison, and speculation. The tabloids had labelled him the Spare, a designation that carried its own burden of diminished expectations and conditional acceptance. Diana watched her son navigate this landscape and understood that adding questions about his paternity would not free him, but rather trap him in a different kind of prison. The question of whether he truly belonged to the family that had shaped his entire existence would follow him forever, creating doubt and pain that might never be resolved. Anne came to understand that Diana's silence was not about protecting the institution or maintaining appearances for the sake of royal prestige. It was about protecting a child who deserved to grow up with some sense of stability and belonging. Diana believed that Harry needed time to develop his own identity, his own sense of self, before being confronted with information that would challenge the foundations of everything he thought he knew. She wanted him to reach adulthood, to establish himself, to find his own path before the truth came crashing in. The bond between Diana and Anne, forged in those quiet conversations and culminating in the transfer of that sealed envelope, was built on a shared understanding of sacrifice. Diana was asking Anne to hold a terrible secret, to watch Harry struggle with questions of identity and belonging, and to remain silent even when that silence felt like betrayal. In return, Diana was trusting that Anne would recognize the moment when silence became more damaging than revelation, when protecting Harry meant giving him the truth rather than shielding him from it. Diana had also shared something else with Anne during their conversations, something that added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. She claimed that Charles knew, not that he suspected or had heard rumors, but that he actually knew about Harry's true paternity and had chosen to maintain the fiction rather than confront it. According to Diana, this decision was not made out of love or a desire to protect Harry, but rather out of calculated consideration for appearances and the smooth functioning of the monarchy. Charles had allegedly decided that acknowledging the truth would create more problems than it solved, and so he simply proceeded as if the question had never been raised. Even more troubling was Diana's suggestion that this decision had not been made by Charles alone. She indicated that Camilla had been involved in discussions about how to handle the situation, and that Camilla had advocated for a particular approach. Rather than any dramatic revelation or public acknowledgement, the strategy would be to gradually distance Harry from the line of succession, to subtly diminish his role and importance within the family structure, not through any official decree or public announcement, but through quiet marginalization over time. After Diana's death, Anne's relationship with her brother changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew them well. She became more distant, less willing to engage in the usual family dynamics. She stopped attending certain meetings and declined invitations to events where Charles would be present in a personal rather than official capacity. While she never voiced accusations or expressed overt anger, her withdrawal spoke clearly. Enough. It was the behavior of someone who had lost respect for a family member, who could no longer participate comfortably in situations that required her to pretend everything was normal. Years passed, and the situation evolved in ways that made Anne's promise to Diana increasingly difficult to keep. Harry's departure from royal life, his public interviews discussing his struggles with the family, his obvious pain and confusion about his place in the world. All of these developments weighed on Anne. She watched a man unraveling in public view, grappling with feelings of not belonging that he attributed to various factors but that Anne knew had deeper roots. She saw him seeking answers to questions he did not quite know how to ask, and she knew that she possessed information that might help him understand his own experience. The final catalyst came from an unexpected direction. Harry himself had begun seeking answers. Long before Anne's public revelation, Harry had started to investigate his own doubts. The whispers that had followed him since childhood, the constant comparisons noting how different he looked from his father and brother, the feeling of being slightly apart even within his own family. These things had accumulated over time into a conviction that something was not quite right. And so, quietly and without informing his family, Harry arranged for his own DNA testing. The process was conducted with absolute discretion. Harry used a false name and travelled to a clinic far from anywhere he might be recognised. The samples were collected, the analysis performed, and the results delivered in a sealed envelope that Harry opened alone. What he found was not the clear answer he had hoped for, but rather something more ambiguous and therefore more troubling. There were inconsistencies in the genetic markers, anomalies that did not align with what would be expected from Charles's lineage. Nothing definitive enough to constitute proof, but enough to validate his suspicions and deepen his uncertainty. Meghan, when Harry shared the results with her, responded in a way that no one else in his life had. She believed him without reservation. She did not dismiss his concerns as paranoia or try to convince him he was imagining things. Instead, she encouraged him to seek clarity, to ask the questions that needed to be asked, to demand truth from a family that had too often offered him carefully constructed narratives instead. Together, they discussed what to do with this information and how to proceed when the institution they were dealing with had proven itself adept at deflection and denial. Eventually, Harry reached out to Anne, not through formal channels or official correspondence, but through a simple, direct message that bypassed all the usual protocols. He did not accuse or demand. He simply asked if she knew anything that might help him understand his own life. Anne's response was carefully worded but unmistakable in its implications. She told him that he would know everything when the time was right. A promise that acknowledged his questions without providing immediate answers. For Harry, this response was both reassuring and frustrating. It confirmed that there were indeed answers to be had, but it also meant more waiting, more uncertainty, more time spent wondering about the fundamental facts of his own existence. When Anne finally opened the envelope after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, the weight of what Diana had entrusted to her became immediately clear. The handwriting alone brought back memories of that reception years earlier, of Diana's expression and the quiet desperation in her eyes. But it was the contents of the letter that transformed speculation into something far more concrete. Diana had not written in riddles or vague suggestions. She had been direct, naming a man who had long existed at the margins of royal scandal, but never with this level of explicit confirmation. Major James Hewitt. The letter was brief, as Diana's most important communications often were. She wrote about her suspicions regarding her medical records, claiming that they had been altered or manipulated to obscure certain truths. According to Diana, palace physicians had been given instructions that prioritized discretion over accuracy. When she had pushed for independent medical testing, she encountered resistance that went beyond mere bureaucratic obstacles. Diana described being warned in terms that left little room for misunderstanding. If she pursued independent confirmation of what she suspected, there would be consequences, not just for her, but for her sons. But Diana's letter was only part of the evidence Anne had accumulated. Hidden among palace records discovered during what was officially described as a routine estate audit, Anne found something even more damning. A DNA test report conducted in absolute secrecy in the early 1990s. The test had been performed during the period when Diana's marriage to Charles was disintegrating and rumours about her personal life had reached a fever pitch. Diana had confided in a royal physician who had earned her trust through years of discreet service. The results, when they arrived, were both definitive and devastating. The comparison between Harry and Charles showed zero probability of paternal relationship. The comparison between Harry and James Hewitt showed a probability exceeding 99.7%. In scientific terms, this was as close to certainty as such testing could provide. But what happened next demonstrated just how powerful the forces of institutional preservation could be. Within weeks, the physician who had facilitated it was removed from his position. Files related to the test began to disappear from hospital archives. The report Anne discovered was thin, just a few pages, but stamped across the top in red ink was a directive that spoke volumes. The words "forbidden to disclose" appeared alongside an abbreviation indicating that the order came directly from Her Majesty. This was not a suggestion. This was a command from the monarch herself, instructing that the contents of this file were never to be shared, discussed, or acknowledged. For Anne, seeing this directive was a moment of profound realization. Her mother had not merely suspected or heard rumors. She had seen the evidence and made a conscious decision to bury it.